time. Recording in progress. Please stay with us. Press continue to do so. In a second, we will have got quite a big agenda, so I won't go on. I will let Sado jump straight in with her introduction to this event, which I think will put everything in context. Beyond that, my job will just be to pull in the wonderful talent and panelists that we have today, which we'll hopefully introduce you to as you go. But Beyond Museums is the name of the game today. So if you're in the right place, please sit back, settle in and enjoy. So Sado, when you're ready, please could you say a little about what this is all about, please?
Thank you, Rob. Welcome everyone. I'm Seydou Dadi, the director of Black Southwest Network. Thank you for joining us virtually today, as we both remember where we came from a year ago on this day, and to start to reimagine where we want to go. Over a year ago, Black Southwest Network was both wrapping up a National Heritage Lottery-funded project focused on intangible cultural heritage and the role of decolonization with museums in the Southwest, and preparing to lead a series of workshops with Bristol Culture on decolonization and the museum. Then on June 7th, 2020, we turned our televisions on and saw young Black and white protesters dump the statue of Edward Colston, a man who Bristol Museum website says was a revered philanthropist, reviled slave trader, into Bristol Harbour. To achieve change is hard, but to change is also the only thing that is constant in this world. If we expect people to change in order to move with the times, then we can and should expect the same from institutions. And in the aftermath of Colston, many within the Black community in particular continue to speak out about the need for cultural organization and institutions to begin to enact a real practice of change, moving beyond conversations and into sustainable action. Mainstream organizations say they're committed to change, yet oftentimes this comes with a number of strings attached that really means only slight tweaks. Maybe hiring a Black or brown person and then going back to business as usual. Change in this context is short, superficial, and ends up requiring those at the margins to be the ones to have to change in order to fit into the institution. So change then comes to mean assimilation. This is not the change we're talking about. Change must come from all sides. I do not mean just adding more diversity to a table. For change to happen in a way that won't reproduce the status quo, we need to change the type of questions we ask and the types of actions and outcomes we dream up. This is why we're here, to ask and to begin to answer new questions around race, racism, Blackness, heritage, community, and colonial as a way forward. Our work at Black Southwest Network is as a race equality organization committed to racial justice. Over the past 10 years, we have engaged in both community-based research projects with the support of the National Heritage Lottery Fund and policy reform within the city and the region, one helping to inform the other. Long before Colston came down, Black communities have asked repeatedly for more inclusive and equitable spaces within educational and cultural organizations and institutions. Our latest NHLF project on intangible cultural heritage in the Southwest and the role of decolonization within cultural and heritage organization reiterated this sentiment. Major questions have come out of this work. Can museums, as they are constructed now, actually hold and tell the stories of Black people? Do their walls understand the different tones and voices and perspective and movements that come with Blackness? Can we trust these spaces that for so long could not and would not see us? We focus on museums as a way to engage heritage because these are the locations that house the stories of the nation, weaving a narrative of who does and does not belong and why. For a long time, this space is centered on collective story and voices, filtered through the lens of whiteness. And this lens produced a whitewashed version of who and what the UK is. However, a country created and sustained over centuries by imperialist conquest cannot maintain a history that only sees itself in this light, only sees itself as white. The descendants of those who were once colonial subjects are now asking, demanding that accountability be had for the actions of the past that continue to influence the present. As that present is always present, memorialized in the names we put upon buildings and the people chosen to be immortalized via state-sanctioned statutes. The lack of knowledge and acknowledgement of the impact and influence of diverse heritage in general, and Black heritage in particular, is troubling at best, because we know the UK would not be the UK without these communities, the indigenous land and resources and histories. Therefore, we are in a time of reimagining who we are as a nation and as communities within the nation through a more expanded lens. A lens that centers Blackness, Black people, and allow us to honestly engage the histories of enslavement, race and racism, migration and immigration, so we can then be honest about where we can go. This is where we invite others to reimagine with us. This is what excites me, the future. If we do not bind ourselves to how things are, because that is how they always have been, and instead give ourselves permission to create alternative spaces, third spaces that sit in between what is and what can be. Just imagine what we could do. For BSWN, one of our key strategic objectives is to build a Black digital decolonial museum that does exactly that. And it might not even be called a museum. It's just the language we have now to describe these types of spaces. And when our language confines us, then maybe it is time to let go of the confining parts instead of asking us all to fit into a tiny cramped space. Borrowing from the great Toni Morrison, she said, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. I say, if there's a space you need that can hold and understand your full humanity, but it does not exist, then you must build it. Thinking beyond museums allows us to think beyond a narrowed view of humanity and a human experience, incorporating different ideologies, perspectives, and cosmologies. This work is really about reclaiming humanity, and we cannot do that in spaces that for so long were committed to dehumanizing practices. I do not say this lightly. I'm just stating a truth from the perspective of someone who became Black once I stepped onto these shores, which then removed my individuality, culture, history, family, and replaced it with a static, narrow understanding of who I am through a white lens. I'm much more than that, as you all are much more than the labels put upon you. Heritage is about humanity. And we're calling on all of us to reclaim our humanities by reimagining what could be. So please, dream with us as we start this timely discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Sado. And that's a great setup, and we can dig into that some more. In a minute, please can I invite Dr. Errol Francis to come and give his contribution. In terms of the questions, thanks for asking questions so far. Recording can be made available. We'll make more details about how and when. Also, as you may have also seen, the Q&A down the bottom is a place for public questions to be made, which you can track them as your ideas arise. But can I thank Sado very much for that initial setup. Look forward to getting into more depth in the panel discussion of all this stuff. But Dr. Errol Francis, can you give us your reflections, please, on the concept of beyond museums and where we're going to go from here? Sado talked about an expanded lens, a third space or different spaces. What can you offer us, please, Dr. Errol, about this concept of beyond museums?
Thank you, Rob and Sado, for the introduction. Okay, I'm just activating the video. Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody who's attending. My name is Errol Francis. I'm Director of Culture And, which is a London-based arts organisation, arts and heritage organisation that works to open up the UK arts and heritage sector to a more diverse workforce and audience. And we've been working quite closely with BSWN since last year. Now, as Sado has pointed out, it's been a year now since the appalling murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The atrocity sparked a global protest about the way Black people and other racialized communities are treated by not only criminal justice systems in countries who variously style themselves as leaders of the free world or having a sense of fair play, and that this protest was also fueled by the iniquitous impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what started as a protest over the criminal justice system in one country, the USA, quickly developed into an international protest at not only the criminal justice and penal systems, but the whole institutional structure of neoliberal societies in which white supremacy is embedded in the very DNA of institutional and governmental structures at every level. I think museums had thought themselves mostly exempt from this type of critique, yet the protests quickly turned to heritage. What do we mean by it? What do we choose to remember? And to whom does this heritage speak? Crucially, the question of what is the connection between museums and racialized violence became critical. Above all, the issues which had been simmering for some time about contested heritage, the continued celebration of dead white men of the past who enslaved Africans as chattel and seized our cultural assets came to a head. A much brighter light was shone upon questions around how should we tell the story of colonialism and imperialism through the objects held in our national collections. In the UK, this very much came to a head in Bristol, which became an epicenter of protest, where the statue of Edward Colston, a slave trading member of the Royal African country, was torn down and tossed into Bristol Harbour. The same port that had received thousands of enslaved African people traded by merchants during the period of transatlantic slavery. This direct action by the people came after years of fruitless negotiations with city authorities, so the people seized the moment to take their own direct action. Following these events, heritage institutions, not only in Bristol, but across the UK, seemed to compete with one another to post statements saying how they stood in solidarity with the British Black community, and Bristol was no exception. The mayor said, this is not, the mayor, Marvin Rees, said, this is not just an American problem. It's not just an issue with the US criminal justice system. It reflects a systematic inequality that is prevalent across all major institutions in countries around the world. The then head of transformation on behalf of culture and creative industries, Zach Mensah, said, we've been developing our digital offer so people can access accurate stories about the city's history, and they're working on a decolonization project, which involves us scrutinizing our buildings and collections to ensure transparency. We've collected the placards from the Bristol Black Lives Matter event, and will hold the statue of Colston when it is retrieved. Behind the scenes, we've been developing our digital offer and so on. So these statements of apparent solidarity, whilst welcome, do not go nearly far enough to address the range of concerns raised by not only the protests last year, but over many years. And I'm afraid they really do draw attention to the lack of a coherent agenda for equality, diversity, and inclusion. The comments come across as random and tokenistic, poorly connected with each other and lacking in a clear strategic direction. More seriously, I think the authors of these statements did not perhaps realize that rather than indicating a clear commitment to equality and inclusion and social justice in the heritage sector, the statements had the opposite effect of drawing attention to an apparent complicity with colonial violence in the seizing of cultural assets such as the Benin Bronzes, which Bristol has in its museum collection. It unwittingly and implicitly raised the unresolved question of the restitution of looted cultural property in the city's collections and a failure to address inclusion and diversity in their workforce and audience engagement. But Bristol was not alone. This contradiction was highlighted by the main national and local museums, which posted similar statements. Therefore, it was for this reason that Culture and published the Black Lives Matter Charter. And I've just put that into the chat. And we published the charter in order to provide a clear agenda for change based on the historical concerns around diversity that have existed for many years in the UK. And I urge you all to consult this charter, which is on our website, because we believe it provides clarity and strategic purpose, which is so lacking in these responses that we've heard and I've quoted from just now. Now, just after this momentous event last year and these statements, Culture and worked with BSWN to deliver a series of workshops with Bristol museums to highlight the issues that had come to a head in these protests. And in an extended series of workshops, as Sada has pointed out in her introduction, we focused on issues such as diversing the workforce so that it's more representative of the Bristol population, opening up interpretations of heritage that are not only more inclusive, but tackle issues such as contested heritage and provenance and not obscuring Bristol's colonial past. We also focused on the need to curate programs that attract audiences which are at present profoundly alienated by the dominant cultural narrative presented by museums. Now, I'm not sure what the city has made of the issues raised by these workshops, and I'm keen to know what progress has been made. It's been reported that following its retrieval from Bristol Harbour, the Colston statue is to go on display at the Embed Museum in the city, alongside the placards, as we heard before, about the protest. The conservators have stabilised the paint that the protesters sprayed onto the statue, and the placards from the protest will be displayed apparently alongside it. Residents have been invited to take part in a survey to decide its future. Now, this is an interesting development, and I think it probably conforms to the government's retain and explain policy on statuary and public monuments. But I want to put it to you that this is just a beginning, and it doesn't go far enough in terms of addressing the reasons why the statue was pulled down in the first place. The reason why this statue was toppled is not only because it represents an offensive commemoration of the genocidal practice of transatlantic slavery, it was emblematic of a deeper set of issues about museums and their failure to address not only Bristol, but Britain's colonial past. Before it was overtaken by Liverpool, Bristol was the principal city in the UK which participated in and benefited from transatlantic slavery, and the wealth amassed from these activities are still apparent today. While there was an attempt by the ill-fated British Empire and Commonwealth Museum, which existed in Bristol, to address this history between 2002 and 2008, the story of Bristol's involvement in slavery and colonialism is poorly told by its museums, and the issues of contested provenance remain. The Benin Bronze that Bristol Museum has held since 1935 is still, I believe, in its possession. As many of you will know, this is one of the most infamous examples of looted colonial heritage, acquired by the 1897 punitive raid on the proud Kingdom of Benin. It was one of the most appalling actions of the colonial period in which a civilization was destroyed and all of its cultural property stolen. Prince Edun Akwenza, from the present-day Royal Court of Benin, has called upon the city of Bristol to be the first in the Western world to return one of the Benin bronzes. And at the time that this was reported, the council said it would think about it and start to take actions towards restitution. Sadly, the Prince's call has yet to be actioned, to my knowledge. And in March this year, it was the University of Aberdeen that was the first British institution to announce it is to return a Benin bronze after a review found the item had been acquired in an extremely immoral manner. Berlin's Ethnologische Museum at the Humboldt Forum has also promised to return its trove of the Benin Bronzes to Nigeria beginning in 2022. The museum is to return about 500 of the more than 90,000 brass, bronze, and ivory objects stolen by British soldiers in 1897 from the Republic of Benin that are held in its connection. So Bristol needs to get on with returning the sculpture it holds and should not make any conditions on the building of a museum or any other caveat. Yet even this will not be enough to remove the appearance that Bristol is reluctant to acknowledge its role in slavery and colonial violence, nor is the display of the Colston statue enough to address the absence of a coherent narrative about Bristol's slavery and colonialism. It is not enough to say we're developing our digital office so that people can access accurate stories about the city's history. The £107 million cost of the refurbishment of the former Colston Hall, now called Bristol Beacon, says it all to me in terms of the current priorities in the city in relation to culture. I find it frankly obscene that this amount of investment is being provided to renovating a building when groups like BSWN are starved of funding. There could have been a more modest makeover of the building and the rest of the money spent on investing, excuse me, on a coherent diversity and inclusion strategy for museums in terms of workforce, reinterpreting collections and displays, and supporting groups like BSWN to establish an independent cultural space where they can tell their own story to how they can feel proud about being both British and Bristolian. I want to make it clear that addressing the colonial past is not some kind of cultural nicety. Those of us whose ancestors were enslaved are still living with its aftermath. As someone of Jamaican heritage, I am unable to trace my ancestral history further than, say, 100 years because my forebears were forcibly removed from Africa and brought to the Caribbean. I still live with the trauma of dispossession, not just of my ancestral heritage, but my identity and sense of belonging. It's a traumatic memory that is reopened every time I go into museums that either deny or represent this history. And it deeply affects the extent to which I can feel a sense of belonging to the UK, where I've lived all of my life. So we need a radical approach to who works in museums, so this lived experience can be brought to bear on the way that museums address this traumatic past. In order to achieve this, we need a comprehensive cultural and investment strategy to make Bristol's heritage and institutions more equitable, inclusive, and diverse. Bristol is fortunate to have committed and dedicated organizations like BSWN who are leading on addressing the colonial past and post-colonial present. They should be supported to take forward the task of engaging communities and to devise new conceptions of heritage that do not rely on the display of imperialist trophies and objects, but also address intangible heritage and the stories that objects cannot tell. Above all, Bristol needs to step up to the task of devising more ambitious plans to address its past and not cover it up with piecemeal and tokenistic gestures. It needs to do this now before there are further disturbances, because this issue will never go away. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Errol, and perfectly timed as well. Lots there. Violence, I know, is a key theme. Cultural, epistemic, colonial, actual social violence, always a theme. Benin Bronze, fantastic case study, which I know Bristol Museums, we have a case to look at. And also, we're after Matthew Branch, who's up next. We will have a panel which includes Deputy Mayor and Councillor Asher Craig, as well as Lisa from the museum. We have Tom as well from the Old Vic. Basically, the panel will actually be able to look a bit more at Bristol as a city and the institutions that make us up. So Matthew Branch, when you're ready. Matthew's from Brown University and a very talented individual who can tell us actually about ourselves a bit more and about the decolonization in the cultural sector in the Southwest, in which he's actually been working with Black Southwest Network for the last year or so, probably more. So Matthew, are you ready?
Yes, I am. I'm just trying to turn my video on.
Okay.
So if the host could just sort of give me that
Nice picture
access.
anyway.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
There you go.
Yeah, hello.
Even nicer moving picture.
So hi everybody. It's great to be here. You know, Zoom is still weird a year later. So I've just been looking through all of your names just so I can sort of be in virtual space with all of you. It's great to see some friends and colleagues here. And thank you, Rob, for that introduction. So yeah, my name is Matt Branch. I've been working for about 15 years now at this sort of intersection between sort of cultural heritage work, museums, et cetera, and universities, and thinking about what does it mean for institutions, specifically universities and museums, that have been built on exclusion and, you know, decolonization and categorization and dissection and all of that, to now suddenly be interested in engaging those same communities that, you know, we spent hundreds of years excluding. So I'm currently stepping into a role as Associate Director. I'm in one of the offices in Student Affairs here at Brown University, and I was really fortunate to be able to do, as part of my grad work, to come on over to Bristol and do some research with Sadhu and the fabulous team at Black Southwest Network, which I've worked with for about 2 years. So I'm presenting on behalf of a few of my co-researchers, some of whom are here today, and I'll shout them out, and others who couldn't make it, about this project that we did that is about examining the situation of decolonization within the cultural heritage sector of the southwest of England. And we'll give you all a link to the report, which is up on the BSWN website. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen. So I think can everyone see? Is that the correct screen? Okay, great, thank you. So yeah, so a few years ago, BSWN convened this research to think about what does decolonization look like in the cultural heritage sector? And we came up with this idea to do sort of a bifurcated, a two-part research project. So the first part was engaging with mainstream cultural heritage organizations in Bristol and Bath and Gloucester in the Southwest. And then the second part was to engage with community-based organizations, right? So we're asking, you know, what are these organizations doing around decolonization, inclusion? What are their understandings of those terms? And how are they working together and not working together? Because one thing you always hear is that, you know, people are interested in partnership with outside organization, but you don't always hear all sides of the story, right? So either there might be the community organizations talking about their issues and challenges working with mainstream organizations, or mainstream organizations talking about sort of the challenges about looking for the community, right? So really quickly, you know, this is our methodology. We employed a qualitative research design. So we did 32 interviews over the course of 2 years with 28 mainstream and community-based organizations. And our goal is to gain an in-depth understanding of perceptions, experiences with regard to both inclusion and decolonial practice in the cultural heritage sector. And so the interviews with mainstream organizations were conducted in July and August of 2019, and the community-based organizations were conducted in May and June of 2020. And that's really important, like especially in our conversation that we're having today. And I'm going to ask you all to save those dates, right? Because the interviews with the mainstream organizations were conducted in a before period, right? So before we have the pandemic, before we have the fall of the Colston statue, right? That really shifted a lot of things. And then the interviews with the community-based organizations were mostly conducted during the pandemic, but mostly before the fall of the Colston statue, but a few were conducted after. So that really, things shifted a lot in terms of the language, in terms of what people were interested in. And I want to shout out my colleagues and friends and collaborators, Jen Sharrett, who I worked on the mainstream organization interviews with, Christelle Pellicour, who led the team on the community-based organization interviews and writing, and Suzanne Van Even, who I see is here today, and I'm so happy to see in the chat, who really led on putting this report together. So the areas for discussion that were really important for us were, we wanted to see how all of these institutions and the staff that worked at them were defining inclusion and decolonization. It's really important for us to know what we mean when we say certain things, right? And so what do people mean with inclusion and decolonization? And then, how are people engaging with that? What are the barriers? We also wanted to get a sense of what the successes were of the ways that organizations have been engaging with inclusion and the changes they'd like to see within their organizations and the cultural sector as a whole. And the other thing that we really were interested in is how were they engaging and collaborating from mainstream organizations to community organizations and back, and what are the challenges there? So here's a list of all of the organizations that we worked with, and we cannot thank them enough. As you can see, it's a pretty comprehensive set, and we can talk a little bit later or in other times about how we define mainstream organizations or community-based organizations. But we did make that distinction based on who's leading the organization, what the missions are, right? And these are the organizations that participated. So here are some findings. So basically, the way that I'm breaking this up is to findings within the interviews for the mainstream organizations and the findings from the community organizations, and those speak together. And then we're going to talk about why that matters in this context now, 1 year out from Colston, and also with this idea of beyond museums. Why are we even thinking beyond museums? And I, thank you, Seydou and Dr. Francis for that those introductions and those presentations about that topic. So one thing that we found when we were thinking about these definitions is this inclusion versus decolonization, right? And participants in the mainstream organizations were comfortable, and I highlighted that, they were comfortable with defining and explaining inclusion, right? Inclusion is something that doesn't really feel it feels good for everyone, right? It's not sort of as threatening, right? And inclusion is associated with terms such as welcoming, accessible, diverse, representative. And those words are all like hospitality words, right? Like if you have someone over your house, you want to be welcoming to them, right? You want to be relevant to them. But, the word inclusion, what it's missing is some of the things that Dr. Francis and Seydou were talking about a little bit earlier, relations with power, with structures, with systems, right? But the participants were challenged by, and so I invite you to see the difference between, they were comfortable with or challenged by and had a really difficult time defining decolonization and even talking about how they engaged with that. So I have a bunch of different quotes that I'm going to just read out from the participants that I think really illustrate a lot of these points. So one participant said, "I must admit, for me, I really don't like the decolonizing word. It almost pigeonholes an issue that is much more fundamental, which is about museums in particular, and cultural institutions generally being inclusive, engaging, where the buildings, collections, the staff reflect the community that those museums are serving and are dynamic, exciting places," right? So you see that this participant, and most of the participants were leaders in the organization, either at the very top or department leaders, not only just talking about not liking decolonizing, but pivoting to inclusion, right? Where they go back to that hospitality language, right? They reflect the communities and they're serving and they're dynamic and so the discussion of power and resources, all of these things are sort of missing here. And we had another panelist who spoke to this, a participant who spoke to this about, this person's colleagues in the sector, saying that fear is a big motivating sort of piece, and why, the term decolonizing is so challenging. Fear, perfectionism, a loss of control. I think that is something that people worry about, that curators are fearing their jobs are under threat, and they perceive that there is sort of a move from specialization, and they're going to move to being generalist and more around engagement and so on. So I think that there's a sense that we need to kind of protect what we've got. Right. And I think Dr. Francis really, has alluded to that in a lot of different ways. And I think it's unfortunate that the decolonizing agenda is running alongside the sort of thing that is going on in people's mind. And that is a hard thing to unpack and challenge, because I don't know that this is something that people necessarily say overtly to you. Right. So we're getting at a lot of layers here. Right. So there are things that are not being revealed that people might be thinking, but they don't want to say. They don't necessarily want to say, "Oh, I want to keep what I have." Right. So how can we even have these conversations with people that are not even going to be honest? right? So thinking about like what actually needs to shift beyond tokenization. Another piece is this tension between professed values and actions, and this idea of a core audience that that institutions see as the primary audience and the new audience or the diverse audience that they're trying to seek. So organizations see, everyone saw institutional attitude as a barrier to inclusion. Sorry for the typo there, right? But institutional attitude is something that's hard to define and to locate, right? Does that sit with the director? Does that sit with the board? Does that sit with the objects? Does that sit with the building, right? Where does that, and when we interviewed people, we couldn't find that, right? We talked to directors, we talked to curators, we talked to engagement folks. No one took credit for institutional attitude. Right, it's slippery and it's institutional. It's baked in, so it's hard to change and it's hard to get rid of, right? And so one way to sort of institutionalize or to get towards inclusive values is to institutionalize those values in the same way that all the bad things are institutionalized, right? So centering those values, putting it in your mission, and some of the organizations were successful with that. The other thing that was really interesting is that this perception about the needs of a primary audience, right, which is often a white audience, an older audience, being in tension with the desired audience, right? What does it mean if we're going to invite a whole bunch of new people if the old people don't want them there? Who feels a sense of ownership of all of these spaces? And I have a few quotes for you on this, right? So, one organization talked about how they've minimized barriers to inclusion. And one of the reasons that they've been able to minimize the barriers is that they are a mental health learning organization, a museum, and they can't just say we need to be including everyone and everybody who wants to be a part of it and see if we can fit them in, right? So they focused and they centered difference. They centered mental health particularly, and that's in the mission, that's in the fabric, right? And it's not something that can be put off to the side, if that makes sense. Okay. And so another person talked about the idea of audiences versus audiences. I think the idea of self-policing audiences is a real problem. So we might be inclusive, but our audiences are sometimes not. So we might do a lot to get people through the door, and then other audience members cause them to leave again by questioning which toilets they go into in terms of the gender that they look like. So this institution had a particular film where they had a large Black audience, and the Black audience was vocal and boisterous, and some of the other white people complained because that is not how they consider cinema should be watched. Right. And the question there is who gets to be centered in the space, who gets to define how things should be, and who gets to be centered and considered the core audience, right? And who gets pushed out. And another one is if you're trying to change the organization, which this person is trying to do, trying to change the culture, the feeling, get more contemporary and more engaged. The question is, how do you bring along the audience who love you the way you are? So it's important to think about how you bring your audience along, right? And so who are we thinking about, right? And these are often things that we hear when we think about sort of being inclusive. Well, what about the people who like us already? What about that? And this idea that if you do one thing, everybody else will go, right? And that tension there. Another piece is partnerships, and we're going to talk a lot about that with the community organizations, right? And from the mainstream organization point of view, we found that there were about 2 different types of common partnerships. Something that's based on content or project-based, so either collaborating on public programming or an exhibition, and then also outreach-based, I'm going to say this in quotation marks, partnerships, right? Where institutions reach out to Ujima or Babasa and say, oh, can you help us get this word out there, right? This is something that, some of the mainstream organizations would see as partnerships, but I would argue is actually not partnerships, right? You're asking the other organization to sort of to reach community members, but there's not really an exchange back and forth, right? And so, one thing that can be successful is institutionalization of, sorry, that's a typo from the last one. So partnerships are often one-off and hard to sustain. So we'll see you all for that exhibition. We'll come find you for the exhibition about Jamaican people or Windrush, and well, the grant money dried up, so goodbye, and we'll see you next time, right? But there are institutions that have symbiotic, that work for everyone relationships, longstanding community partnerships. The other thing that we found is there's often confusion about who is responsible for community collaboration. So let's get into that. So one organization, they built on the success that they had from an exhibition, right? They did an exhibition. It was a diverse exhibition. They brought in a lot of people from outside of the UK, and then they leveraged that to develop a relationship with the Easton Community Center. And they continue to run, and well, this is as of 2 years ago. I'm not sure what they're doing now, but continue to run monthly family workshops. And they're growing them in Redcliffe, and they're about to open them into a third venue. So what's really interesting about this is that this organization is working with institutions outside of the building of the museum or whatever institution it is, right? They're going to the community members and like meeting them where they're at and centering them, right? So you're not noticing that like, oh, we need these people to come help us with our exhibition. We're going to go out, we're going to work with people where they're at, and we're going to leverage our resources. And someone else said, I think our job is to empower organizations and then get out of the way. Make sure that we're not in competition. We are a good city center venue for those people too. So those organizations that don't have loads of resources, we can be an anchor place for that, right? So this person is acknowledging that the community organizations don't have the same sort of institutional power, right? And that institutional power can be leveraged in service of people who don't have that power. And here's some other things. So in terms of who should be doing that work, they say, well, we engage with certain groups. There are one-off engagements or personal relationships. There might be one person who seeks out to build those relationships, but it's not really an alliance. And I really love that word, alliance or partnership. It doesn't really qualify at that level. I don't think we're alone in an organization trying to find the right bridges to connect people and places. So what's really interesting about that term bridge is the institutions are not seeing themselves as that bridge, right? There has to be someone else who is in between, right? Like it's not the job of the institution to be working directly with the community often. They go and find someone who's going to be that conduit. Someone said it's about finding that initial person within the community to talk to because there's no directory. Can you imagine that? There's no directory of who the community members are. It's not always clear who the best person to talk to is. Someone acting as a conduit, assisting in finding the best person to speak to. And this person said, oh, maybe we should go to Black Southwest Network and say, is this worth going to communities about? Did we get it right? Did we get it wrong? So you can see how this expertise in terms of community engagement is, I would argue it's ghettoized, that it's not seen as the role of the home institutions to know how to do that. No, you've got to go find someone who knows how to do that. Or maybe you hire someone who knows how to do that, but when they leave, it's not institutionalized. Okay, and so now moving over to the findings from the community organization. So we worked with a diversity of community organizations from daycares to radios, radio centers, all of those. And here's what they had to say. I mean, and we're going to focus specifically on what they had to say about the mainstream organizations. They had, we talked about other things, but I'm not going to focus on that today. So in terms of challenges for community organizations with mainstream organizations, they broke down into two different sections. So they found that mainstream organizations have a lack of drive for real change, and they have a lack of engagement for community-based organizations. And we've already seen some of that bear out, right? That it tends to be one-off or, see you later, I'll come back when we have the next exhibition. So just diving down a little bit into the lack of drive for change, that's broken down into an unwillingness to give up power. Right, so the community organizations named power when the mainstream organizations named welcome, relevance, inclusion. Right, the idea of institutional racism and mainstream organizations and funding bodies not giving the community-based organizations the tools with which to succeed at grant writing processes and those sorts of things. So they're not able to succeed, they're not able to compete, and so they don't get the money, right? Oftentimes people work part-time or volunteer for the community-based organization. So it's not like they can spend 40 hours a week all the time writing the grants. Changes, and I'm glad Dr. Francis brought this term up, made are only appear to be tokenistic, not real, not systemic. And there needs to be a need for an open and coordinated discussion. So what was interesting here is that some of the organizations, the community-based organizations, wanted to make sure that they were going to be anonymous because they didn't want it to be clear to the mainstream organizations who said what, because they didn't want those relationships to be jeopardized, right? So the power that is there. So here's a quote. I guess it stems back to systemic and institutional racism. You build a structure, you build it for your own benefit and your own advantage, and people just don't want to give that up. People do not want to give up power. They do not want to give up advantage. And it's difficult for Black and brown people to try and break down a structure you haven't created. And we've seen that with some of the, the people in the mainstream organization saying that same thing about giving up power. Because you don't even get an opportunity to be inside, right? There's the insider outsider who gets to be considered inside to have these conversations, and there's nothing you can do from the outside. I would have said that that's one of the barriers. Here's another participant. I think there should be something around best practice for how to deal with and work with and engage with BAME organizations, and not just, use us to kind of tick your diversity box for that financial year for your funders. Right? This sound familiar to everyone? And also have the funders follow up and follow through and be checking in on the relationships between the mainstream organizations and the community organizations, right? So have a vested interest and a stake in the success of the community-based organizations in addition to those of the mainstream. That might be worth looking into. And now just diving in about the lack of engagement piece with community organizations, we found, and this was true on the mainstream organization side and the community org side, everyone acknowledged a lack of diverse representation in the workplace. Diverse representation in the workplace, in the collections, in the audience, and a lack of trust from the community organizations to the mainstream organizations. Because if you're just coming to visit and I'll see you for the next exhibition, you're not really building, right? And you're not really offering. And a culture of exclusion being the norm rather than inclusion. And this term called extractive and, dare I say, colonial relationships, where you go out, where the mainstream organizations might go out, seek out the community members for an exhibition or for a program or something, extract and bring that home to the mainstream organization without sort of engaging outside or centering the people in the community. And then, as we saw before, great difficulty building meaningful partnerships. And then, as I alluded to earlier, the lack of capacity on the part of community orgs who might be working 3 jobs or who might be doing this part-time and who don't necessarily have the £100K a year salary to be able to do everything that they want. And here are just a few more quotes. And I think it's just ongoing exploitation of the BAME community that mainstream orgs utilize whenever they need something, or their funding is at risk. I want to talk a little about risk in a second. Or there's a pressing issue that they want to use people from the community. It's not just about engaging the communities, it's about building relationships with the communities. And that's not what's happening. White artists who have links with the community, and when they use them to get people involved in their project, they're paid, and they're paid fairly, and they're paid an actual day rate, and they get paid on time, and there's no excuses. Whereas from where I've heard, and in my experience, that's not the same for BAME communities. It's, we don't have funding to pay you, and that's it. So how does this matter, and what does this matter for this conversation beyond museums and the fall of Colston statue? So, one thing that in terms of an opportunity is that the COVID pandemic and the toppling of the Edward Colston statue have eradicated notions of what is possible. Right? So suddenly we're all working from home. Suddenly things can be accessible. People can work from home. We can have those needs, right? So, the present and the future there are more possibilities than I think we give ourselves credit for. The other thing that's really interesting is institutions often engage in reactive, risk-based modes of engagement. So one thing that we noticed is, when a group of people came and tore that statue down, the statue of Edward Colston, and threw that into the harbor, the risk to having the Colston name was greater than the risk to keeping the Colston name and satisfying the funders, right? And so I invite my colleagues here in the museum sector to think about, what does it mean that in order for something to shift dramatically, that like people need to go into a square and throw down a statue, right? Is that the type of engagement that we want to have, right? And do we want a storming of the Bastille type of situation before anything changes, or can we make these changes sort of before that happens, before things are literally torn down? And then there's this idea of going beyond museums, right? As you can see, people don't always have trust in museums to do the right thing or to do something beyond something that's tokenizing. So people have created their own space, and they're interested, a lot of people, in creating spaces rather than engaging in spaces that have failed to sort of rise to the occasion again and again. And then this is the last quote I have, and then I'll close it down. But what we see now, and this is from someone who we talked to right after the statue got taken down, is that white people are actually wanting to break down those structures. And because white people want to break it down, it's easier. Because that's what I've witnessed. Definitely over the last few days, the minute there's white engagement, the structure that they're benefiting from starts to crumble. Slowly starts to crumble. The challenge for us always was, because it isn't our structure, you know, we've had years and years of fighting and trying to chip it away and break it down, and all we've been able to do is chip. Right. So as we think about that, I'm encouraging my colleagues who work in museums and theaters and all these spaces to think about that idea of risk. Right. And what is the personal risk to you? And what is the risk of not sort of starting to think about engaging with decolonization in a better way? Right. So that, I mean, I'm really excited about the panel, and I have some questions for you all. But that's it. You all can, I think Mina put a link to the report in the chat, but you can find it on the Black Southwest Network website. And you can reach out to Sadhu or any one of the BSWN fabulous team members if you're interested in finding out more. And I'm also around virtually if anyone is interested in engaging. So thank you so much. And I'll look forward to breaking bread with everybody during the panel. Thanks.
Wow, that's superb, Matt. Thank you so much. That's very, very deep. We knew you were going over time, but it was like, well, this guy's got so much to say. A lot of work's gone into this thing. And actually, when it comes to the meat and potatoes of these conversations, there's obviously a lot of rich actual content that can be drawn from there. So thank you very much. I think we're going to put a link, as Matthew said, there's one already in the chat, but I think we're also going to put up a link and a QR code for anyone who knows how to use QR codes. But that's super rich and amazing. And I'm sorry we don't have more time. This will go much quicker than we anticipated, I'm sure. Panel-wise, I think we've had a good setup about what beyond museums mean. It's quite radical notions, I think, have been put forward beyond inclusion and diversity. Even decolonization has a little bit more of I don't know about definition, but at least a kind of a sense of aim around it. These are all big ideas. So hopefully people here attending can get some rich material. This recording, thanks for your questions, will be available in the Black Southwest Network YouTube channel, as well as we will make it available by sending it out to people who've signed up around the time of the next Black Southwest Network newsletter. I can't tell you exactly when that's going to be, but yes, it will be available. So are we going to have a QR code or something about the link? If not, the link is in the chat for Matthew's very, very rich report. Yes, there's some, please use the Q&A. We've got one already, which we'll come back to about pitting museum against community, etc. Although I think Matthew's covered that a bit. And also, please keep, if you want to make your question more public or you want to see other people asking a question, use the Q&A, but we will also respond to them from the chat. So, panel, new people that you have not heard from yet. Of course, Errol, Sado, and Matthew are there as well. But I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So stand by Asha, and then Cleo, Edson, thanks for joining, then Kelly, then Lisa, then Tom. If you could just say, I mean, you've obviously heard what you've heard, so maybe you can say just something very brief about your role, as it were, in relation to this discourse. And maybe just to position yourself in relation to what you've heard and say maybe something about, maybe you can add another piece to the puzzle or try to reframe one or have you on it. So maybe some brief intros at first, and then we give it, and when everyone's spoken, when we've heard from Tom, I think he'll be the last of the new panelists, then we can open up for more dialogue. So thank you very much, Councillor and Deputy Mayor Asha Craig.
Hi, thank you so much, Rob, and very much welcome this discussion, a discussion that we should have had a long time ago. But you know, we're on a journey, and I think that's one thing that we need to remind ourselves. So as Deputy Mayor, I'm Cabinet Lead with responsibility for communities, equalities and public health. And one of my responsibilities is around events. I'm not the lead on culture, But clearly, because this is such a significant issue for us here in this city, I, of course, took more than a keen interest in addressing this whole issue around reparations and decolonization and the impact that the transatlantic slave trade had had on our ancestors. So one of the things that I had done pre-COVID and well before the statue came down is I was being kind of inundated by requests from a number of different leading players in the city around slavery. What is the council going to be doing? I've got this great idea. I want to do X. I want to do Y, and it came to a head for me when I thought, well, there are all these different interested parties around the city. Each one has a story to tell and a contribution to make, but one is not any more important than each other. And for me, the biggest gap in the conversation was, where is the conversation happening with Black people, those of us who are directly impacted, our ancestors? So I initially corralled everybody into a room at the M Shed, different organizations, including Black Southwest Network, the Merchant Venturers, the University, Cargo, Black Wave, you name it, everyone who had something to say was in that room. And what I really wanted to do was I wanted everyone to share the kind of journey that they had been on, what their hopes and aspirations were going forward. And so we had a kind of a series of those conversations, and the committee is now known as the Legacy Steering Group. Obviously, we didn't see the toppling of the Colston statue, and we had paused on the work of the Legacy Commission because of what was happening around COVID. But then following the death of the murder of George Floyd and then the toppling of the statue, and as you heard from in Errol, some of which I agree and some of it I don't disagree with Errol, kind of Marvin made the announcement that we were going to have a history commission to begin that journey and that discussion. But as a legacy steering group, I was very clear from the outset that the voice that had been missing about everything that happened in the city, particularly around the issue of Colston, because remember, it was just a group of privileged white men sitting in a room making the decision about how much money they were going to put in and revere this man, this slave trader in our city. Not even the wider citizens of Bristol had any stake in that decision that has been made. And I suspect how many of our citizens have had a stake in any of the decisions that have been made about statues and monuments in this city and globally. So for me, it's really important that our communities, African heritage communities, those of us directly impacted by slavery, our voice is front and center in that conversation. And so it was a no-brainer for me, and I think Cleo may go on to talk about the work that she's done and we funded in order to begin that discussion and that conversation with African heritage communities. And again, that has taken on an even more of an importance following the passing of the reparations motion that we had. So Sado, very, very powerful introduction that you made. I agree with everything that you have said. And I think what's really important is that the conversation, in fact, many of the points, I've written there was lots to write down, and I know I've not got a lot of time, and maybe some of that will come out in the discussions that we're having. But one of the things I do want to remind people is that Bristol has taken a number of great strides, particularly in the last 5 years of our administration. You talked about the decolonization project and the work that Black Southwest Network has been doing with our museum service. So we're moving in the right direction. But people need to understand we can't undo what was done to us in 5 years, maybe not even 10 years. but we're on that journey. And what we have to remember is that the change process that we are on, we have to embed that into the DNA of this city and the organizations. So when Errol is talking about, yeah, I get it, 107 million pounds in capital investment on the Beacon Centre. It sounds obscene, but then actually when you think back to the millions, maybe billions of pounds that this city has actually invested in a whole range of different civic and other institutions, 107 million pales into insignificance. So we have started our journey around reparatory justice, what that looks like, but we are at the beginning of that discussion. Many conversations have been had in many different corners of this city, but no conversation has been had with the wider city. So the exhibition that kicked off last Friday, and I will say I haven't seen the exhibition, I haven't even gone online to look at the exhibition yet. So I'm not going to comment on the exhibition, though I know what's there. It's the start of that conversation with the wider city. And there may be things that people are upset about, but that is what a consultation is about. We want to hear from all corners of the city, but for me, predominantly, I want to ensure that the voice of African heritage communities are front and center at this debate around decolonisation and reparations generally. And I'll leave it there.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Asha, Deputy Mayor. And Cleo, please, what say you beyond museums, all you've heard, what can you add to the mix?
Yeah, lots of things to think about here and really good presentation. So glad to be here. I think a note to say, it seems like the exhibition displaying the statue of Colston is already being sabotaged, with people intent on us not progressing, booking up tickets and doing all types of things to ensure that voices aren't heard, which is disappointing. I should say that I think I was probably one of the people corralled by Asher Craig to go onto the Legacy Steering Group, or maybe I'd forced my way on, as sometimes we have to in these particular circles. But I have been a part of the Legacy Steering Group, which I see as very positive. It's a good network, really, of people in the city, institutions, individuals, etc., who want to see some positive change come out of this legacy. And as Asha mentioned, I have been the lead consultant on Project Truth, which stands for Telling, Restoring, Understanding Our Tapestry and History, which has the purpose of being an educative consultation with African heritage communities, because we're not a homogenous group, and is to really find out what African heritage communities in the city and connected to the city want to see happen as part of the legacy of the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans. And it was a partnership with Legacy Steering Group, Black Southwest Network and Ujima Radio, because it included a weekly education radio show. I think a lot of what's been said really does speak to the aspects of control, equity, wealth distribution, and the need to topple privilege to an extent, which will make people uncomfortable. Just looking at a couple of the comments in the chat, yeah, maybe there should be support for institutions to decolonize, but that should be adequately funded and prioritized. I'm glad to hear of the work by your company, Errol Francis Culture, and in terms of a kind of manifesto or a roadmap in terms of what needs to happen next. And I think that is a good way of taking things forward, having documents and things that can inform these institutions. I also noted another comment from Lee talking about an audit. I completely agree. And besides the enormous amount of money to revamp what was the Colston Hall, now the Bristol Beacon, which I do support in many ways. I think it's important that we have fantastic facilities in our city and very much involved in arts and culture. However, I was alarmed when I learned as a councillor a year or so ago that actually the Bristol Beacon via Bristol Plays Music does receive £500,000 in unrestricted funds a year. This really is a slap in my face from my own personal experience, because when I was attempting to lead the St. Paul's Carnival from 2012 to 2015, it was always a complete struggle to even get £60,000 to deliver a free event for over 100,000 people on the streets. And I would also say from my personal experience that when I was in the driving seat through one of the most challenging periods of St. Paul's Carnival, it was interesting how I tried to navigate my way to collaborate with city institutions, which was an exhausting, disempowering process, which almost pushed me back into a kind of stereotype as an angry Black woman, if you will, because I was unwilling to smile and wave whilst living on my knees. And to see the same people now smiled in my face when I was either Lord Mayor or now post-George Floyd and statue topple, with their name changes and taking the knee, is quite staggering, to be absolutely honest. And it's not that I'm against this shift, but I question the motives. I also saw this coming in terms of Arts Council funding a few years ago, when cultural institutions were forced to be more diverse with the case for diversity. What else can I say? I will try and be positive. I'm sure there is a way forward and to find a happy medium, but it's exhausting work. I also do acknowledge and welcome, for example, the Church of England with their contested history guide towards a matrix, compiling a matrix of change that can inform and support churches and other institutions in terms of what they can do in terms of contested history and artifacts. For example, a church in Dorset realised that they had a tablet or a plaque which was celebrating someone who was responsible in Jamaica for quashing an uprising leading to the death of 500 enslaved Africans. Because of George Floyd, they suddenly realised that this was no longer acceptable and had it removed and put into a nearby museum. I would say in terms of Bristol, what is happening now is that different partners are coming together, aspects and elements of our community from an African heritage perspective, so that we actually work together and create our own repair plan on our own terms. And I think that's entirely necessary. And when we think of museums as well, it's about, well, what is the purpose of a museum? And is the name museum even relevant to some people? Should that also be reframed? Should it be a centre of remembrance or whatever else, interpretation centre? But I think these are all important questions.
Thank you very much, Cleo. Can I invite Edson, please, to make take a view, please, and a brief intro to your role in relation to this discourse.
So I'm Dr. Edson Burton, and I've been in Bristol since 1994, and I guess I've worked as an artist, as a historian, as a researcher, associate, possible sometimes friend, to various community organizations and various cultural, what we might call mainstream city centre institutions. So I guess in some ways the advantage, there are many disadvantages, but the advantage of a portfolio life like this is that you get to see different perspectives, the disconnections, disjunctures, the problems in different ways. And sometimes perhaps dream about solutions. I guess so much came out of the two presentations that I'm going to try and be brief, because I'm hoping that there'll be a chance to pick things up in the chat. I guess one of my main concerns is whether we were asking the question of, what is the nation that the museum serves? And if I ask that question because I guess museums were built, the cultural sector is built around, at some point historically, around a particular idea of what the nation is and who that visitor is. And that is both class and race and so many other aspects. It's also built at a time when people didn't get to travel to Turkey, to Tunisia, to Egypt, and so on, to see what the world looked like in its different places. But if we ask the question, what is the nation? Then we have to then ask the question, what is the nation now? And it strikes me that the demographic shifts, the ideological shifts, the different perspectives create a conundrum around how we now serve and tell a national story. And that we are at this moment in time with post-Brexit nation reaching out for trade deals wherever else and so forth. And at the same time, with certain actions and speeches by our current government, it seems that this is very much to the fore and very much part of the conundrum around what is the identity that the museum is reaching and looking to serve. But if I look at the future and if I look at where we are at now, then clearly what the museum was made for, the story, the national story it was trying to tell, is no longer what it was. So much of British identity has become mixed up with imperialism. Rule Britannia as a national narrative, for example. But then what happens then if that, if Rule Britannia, if those people who should never will not be slaves, well, actually, this is the audience for the museum, and increasingly so, demographically, will shift. So this isn't, in a sense, around also decolonization and so forth, but it's around looking ahead, telling the national story that fits a new nation. The nation is changing, the purpose in the museum needs to change with it. Whose story it is telling needs to change fundamentally, and how it's being told and who for, so that it remains relevant too. But it does mean that we have to be looking at telling a story, and this is where I am probably digressing a bit, which is beyond this notion of British identity being tied up with imperialism. And imperialism justifies itself on the sense of some kind of moral force, as opposed to a superior kind of violence. And in a sense, it's how do you then look at it in the eye for what it is, rather than the sort of comforting narratives which still sustain this national conversation around preserving the empire. I would jump to another point that I want to mention, pause that one there. I think that our funding structures and the way in which funding is created doesn't help to build relationships. And I say that because in a sense, having been someone who's curated projects and also sort of been mindful that I've been extractive too, and institutions I've worked with, you think part of the problem is, and this is a wider one, I think, that relationship building, sustaining relationships is not built into the fabric. What you then have is like co-curation, so on and so forth. But it's actually, these things fall apart, especially when capacity is asymmetrical. And what we need to think of is a different kind of relationship where we recognize the resource differences between organizations, so that it is not about a project approach, but it's about building up, truly building up and resourcing a sector where things are asymmetrical, and hopefully where that kind of relationship in the end means that partnerships and real partnerships, because I think what Matt was alluding to really is that services are being delivered and being called partnerships, but real partnership is possible. And partnerships then create perspectives, different methodologies, different kind of ideologies. And as a student of SOAS, I think I have a sense, I was really stunned by how little I knew about Africa, not in the sense of just like what landmass is here, but the deep ontological understanding and different philosophies. So one of the things I think is fundamental to a university looking forward, museum looking forward and sector looking forward. And what is the thing that we are really trying to restitute? And for me, I think one of the things that we are trying to repair is the encounter between societies that has been brutal and has been unequal. Is it possible to think of transactional relationships, relationships of knowledge exchange, of human curiosity being exchanged? And human curiosity, I think, is something which binds us across the world. But the way it is being conducted at the moment has been in sort of one directional form. And if this kind of restitution is possible, then we would see the movement of cultural assets, movement of resources, and so on around the world in a new way, and in a way which respects different cultures as opposed to the sampling of here and there. I would say one last word and one last sentence at this point. And I think just following Cleo's point, I think if we get to the heart of the problem of funding, and it's really the problem of trust, and it's whether Black communities, communities of color, organizations are actually trusted. And I say this because in the end, one is aware that when trust is there, private donation money follows. And trust takes multiple forms. It's trust in that you're the right people, you're the right agenda, that the money is going to be used in a particular way and so forth. So when we change what we mean by trust, when we think differently about trust, we think also creating an environment in which small organizations are allowed to stabilize, not through the brilliance of SADOs and many others in the BME sectors, but that there will be succession, there will be the capacity for expansion. We think about trust in a much more deeper way, because there's still so much nebulous and backroom politics behind this. Then I think we can get to a new kind of scenario where decolonizations of different sort of situations. At the moment, we talk of decolonization, perhaps that shift to a new kind of language, but that's where we're at now. So that's my contribution.
Thank you, Edson, very much. Can we quickly go to Kelly to just position yourself in relation to this narrative, and also maybe a very quick introduction about how you sit role-wise within it all?
Okay, thank you very much, Rob, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation today. Before I go into my intro, I just want to thank the leadership in the Black communities in Bristol, especially over the past 10 years or so, on really reimagining and indicating, working with African communities throughout the rest of the country to demonstrate that new ways are possible. I also want to acknowledge the way that our conversations in the panel have come around to reparations, because it's impossible to disentangle conversations in the UK, conversations around decolonisation from conversations around reparations and restitution. And so that's a really important thing for me to state. A quick intro to me. I am a public historian. I work both online and what I guess kind of flippantly call on road. So that is, I work within the realms of the open knowledge movement, and also online. So that's platforms like Wikipedia and Creative Commons, as well as leading walking tours and other kind of interpretative experience that are outside of the museum walls. So we are thinking about the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd and the anniversary of the fall of the Colston statue, and I want to get us also to reflect on another anniversary that comes at the end of May and the beginning of June. And that is the anniversary in 1991 of the Unity of African Organization of African Unity, the OAU, forming a resolution on the reparations for the exploitation of slavery in Africa. And really that was the beginning of the kickoff of the building momentum around the reparations movement at the end of the 20th century. And so while we are very much thinking about what's happened in the past year, I also think it's important to reflect that on the fact that we are in a continuation of a struggle to demand justice, and really to frame the way that we're thinking about that. This isn't it can be, despite the fact that we're thinking about the past and heritage oftentimes, the temptation can be often to be very much within the present, and without necessarily acknowledging that we're in a continuation of a much longer, centuries-long struggle. Just to respond to Edson, something that Edson said, relationships. Well, we referred to museums and he was talking generally about relationships, but he mentioned the word fabric, the fabric of the museum. Whilst we are, yes, thinking about people in museums, individuals within institutions, the institutions themselves, but there are also the tools and the infrastructure of those institutions. And the tools and the infrastructure of museums, the databases, the processes through which objects and people are described and categorized are also very much reflective of imperialist, colonial, extractive thought processes and knowledges that when museums were set up to perpetuate and to preserve. So yes, we should be thinking about individuals. Yes, as as Matt challenge us to do. We should be thinking about how we institutionalize values and principles, but we also need to recognize that the tools that museums use are not fit for purpose to be doing that. So how do we move beyond the practices of description, categorization, and the databases, the framework in which those are held in, because that also is, for me, very much a building stone of how these colonial principles really are upheld by memory institutions. I also want to recognize very much, and I think Matt provided us with a really useful framework for doing this. And that is the discomfort and fear that comes with the inevitable disempowerment that we're talking about here, whether it be disempowerment of an individual, the fear of an individual of that, or whether it be the disempowerment of an institution. I think sometimes when we're discussing power, it's almost always about how power is shared, how the marginalized are empowered, without necessarily the acknowledgement that that also means that the privilege also needs to give up some of that privilege and to give up some of those powers. So how can we facilitate that? And then finally, I want to dwell on Sado and how she opened. And one of the things that she opened with that I found very touching and made me reflect. And that was the experience of racialization in coming to the UK, the experience of being racialized as Black. And to go back to thinking about the structures and essentially the purpose of museums and memory institutions, which is to describe, to interpret, to classify. That classification, which includes racialization. How do we develop processes, systems that allow for the expression of the individual or the group that is beyond a kind of top-down classification from authority? How do we disperse notions of authority into something that is more equitable? And for me, fundamentally, as well, we're in a kind of contradictory situation where thinking beyond what a memory institution could be, does it need to be within the four walls? What does it look like when it's outside of what we think of as a museum or an institution? What does that mean to how things are funded, supported? And is it enough to be thinking about the diversification of the workforce if we're not necessarily thinking about the diversification of power? So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Can we move to Lisa, please? And Lisa, as you contextualize yourself, you may also have to contextualize your event poster behind you.
Yeah, hi everybody. Yes, as you can possibly tell, I'm in my office at work at the Museum and Art Gallery at the top of Park Street. So these are some posters of exhibitions that I've worked on over the years. So yeah, that bright pink kind of gets in the way, doesn't it? But yeah, I just want to acknowledge that what Kelly, Edson and Sado especially said, that museums are a colonial construct. There's absolutely no way from getting around that, from our databases to our edifices to how collections have been made. And I'm the World Cultures Curator here, and I look after objects that have very, very checkered histories. And that's just putting it politely. So I know I'm fundamentally responsible for a collection that needs a lot of work for a lot of reasons. I was also been lucky enough to be the project manager for the Colston display. So I've got a lot of, what's the word? Things to say about that, which sometimes, and this is another drawback, working for a city council, sometimes we have to compromise, sometimes the middle road needs to be trod, which can bash up against our personal beliefs. So sometimes the things we can and can't say, which can be frustrating. Museums work at a glacial pace in normal times. Obviously, this last year has made it all the worse. So my kind of question is if this colonial construct that we are trying to kind of decolonize is moving too slowly, perhaps we need to look to other forms, like Sado said, a third space. And I look to places in North America, especially a place that I've been involved with in the last couple of years. We've been trying to repatriate a Native North American hunter's coat back to the Cree Cultural Institute in what is now known as Quebec. And these cultural community centers, they're more than that. They're run and organized by people from the community. Their perspective is very much entirely from their perspective, and they do amazing work in bringing their way of looking at the world to Eurocentric perspectives. There's also another organisation called the Black Archives in Netherlands, who I heard about recently on a webinar. And looking at the work they do to decenter the white perspective it looks amazing. They hold archives, but they also put in exhibitions, education programs. So there are new ways of doing this. We don't have to live in this colonial construct if we don't want to. That's not to say the colonial constructs shouldn't be challenged and changed and moved on, but there are other ways of doing this. And so, yeah, I'm excited to hear other people's thoughts on that. I could say more, but I'll let other people speak now.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And finally, for the panel introductions, we have Tom from the Bristol Old Vic, from where I'm sitting right now. Thanks for the hospitality, Tom. I won't decolonize the place just yet, but
go ahead.
I'll deal with the hospitality for now. Thanks. So Tom, sorry. So yeah, please. I heard so much.
Thank you, Rob. First of all, I want to say it's a great honour to be in this conversation, and thank you to Black Southwest Network and everyone involved. If you haven't already seen Errol's lecture on the Benin Bronze, which I think Sado has put the link to in the chat, really do see that. It not only talks about the Benin Bronzes, but it's, if you want a demonstration of what the decolonization of a museum space might look and feel like, it's a brilliant description of that. All of the contributions have been really inspiring and challenging. I want to just talk briefly about three things. The first is picking up on what Asha said about this being a journey. And certainly from the point of view of my job, which is artistic director of the Bristol Old Vic, an establishment venue in the middle of Bristol, it very much resonates with what Matthew was saying about assuming that welcome was enough. The journey for me, well, I could start it anywhere, but it really does start with Roger Griffiths, then working at Ujima, literally banging on the door of the theatre in 2016 in our temporary offices. And I said, what do you want? And he said, you're not doing enough for my community. I thought that we were being welcoming. He said, you're not even being welcoming, and you need to go a lot further than that, and introduced me to a great many people, including Edson, Sado, Asha, and Cleo, who told me in no uncertain terms what was lacking and what progress was needed, and then introduced me to others like Des Brown and Chino Edemba across the city, and indeed you, Rob, who told me the same thing. What I mean, the point of bringing that up is that this journey is one that involves mistakes, and it involves being wrong or having been wrong. There's no other way to make progress. And what inspires me about this and similar conversations, particularly the emerging one about reparation, is the generosity with which it's being conducted. The fact that there are people in the city who are being inclusive about the possibility for change to members of establishment organizations like Bristol Old Vic. Reparation is a frightening concept to many people, but it doesn't need to be. It is about meaningful repair, meaningful rebalance of power. I want to talk briefly about this Colston statue and why I think it's so important in the city. Because one of the legacies that the city has lived with is a legacy of the suppression of truth. it was a revelation to me in doing some research into the 18th century in Bristol, to discover that the myth that everyone thought the enslavement of African people was okay was a myth. That Thomas Clarkson, when he came to Bristol in 1787 and researched the abolition movement, he writes, "Everyone I meet says the trade is execrable, but no one sees any prospect of abolition." People, of course, knew it was wrong. People have always known it was wrong. And what we're living with is the legacy of a concerted act of suppression of conscience by the establishment in order to make it feel okay that that ongoing violence continued for many years after 1787 and in different ways ever since. Having Colston visible in the city is vitally important and I've again not been to see that the new exhibition, because the erection of that statue in the late 19th century was part of that ongoing suppression of the truth. And we need to continue to dig into that and articulate it in order to understand what the social legacy is on the people who've been disadvantaged ever since, in the way that Errol was talking about in his very moving introduction today. The last thing I want to do is try to pick up Cleo's challenge about being positive, because of course there are all sorts of things that must be done. But running a theatre, and this speaks to the question that Kelly was raising about power. One of the powers that we control as a theatre is the power of storytelling, whose stories we listen to. Now, in any situation, my job running a theatre is to find the most interesting and most relevant stories I can, and the best storytellers to tell those and try to release those to the public. And the question I ask myself is, in what sections of our communities are those most vital stories being witnessed and ready to be told now? And of course, a huge answer to that question, and we've seen it in the BAFTAs last night, which I'm sure people can see, celebrated an extraordinary range of emerging storytellers who have emerged at the top of their powers, creating groundbreaking television and film. We in theatre need to do the same by giving the power of storytelling to people whose stories have not been heard before. And if we do that, it's not the complete adjustment of power, it's not the complete statement of reparation, for which, of course, there must be a reparation endowment for the city, and we could talk more about what that is. But it really is a meaningful step. As I said before, the journey we're on involves mistakes, and I expect to continue making mistakes, as I have relentlessly ever since I've been on this journey. I can't escape that, but I will keep doing my best on the journey. One tiny step is actually bringing Malika Kagodi's story Outlier to the main stage in our theatre next week as the first new production after the pandemic, which is her autobiographical tale, a powerful, vital tale for now. And I guess the challenge is not just to the theatre, but to all of us to seize this opportunity to foreground voices which have not been heard, in order to understand ourselves better and make the kinds of changes that everyone's been talking about that little bit more possible.
Thank you very much, Tom. We have 25 minutes for discussion, and we're not going to get through all the questions. However, please, everybody, note that the Q&A questions, I've just done replies so that you can see what questions being asked. Maybe you want to add to those questions. As someone has said to us in the panelists, if you want other people to see your questions, do it if you do it in the chat, make it the panelists and attendees so other people can see them. But it's also quite hard to keep track of all the chat questions. So use the Q&A if possible. So those 7 answered questions are not necessarily answered, but I'm hoping we can pick them up now. So it's really hard to know where to go next, but well, maybe let's start with the questions. Back to Matt, one of the early questions was, and let's see all panelists, please, if we can keep our responses quite tight so we can get space for other people. But one of the questions, the first question, if you like, on the Q&A is directed straight at you, Matt, really. What about, and I know you've answered it, but just let's put it out there again. Why are you pitting one against the other, community versus mainstream? Who is helping museums to decolonize? And some have said they don't know how to embed decolonizing practices. What about that, Matt?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I'm also interested in hearing how the other panelists would sort of chime in as well. I would first argue that no one's putting anybody against it, but sort of the way that I've seen in my own experiences is that there are these institutions that are institutionalized, that have big endowments. A lot of them are older and they've been able to accumulate resources. And then there are newer community organizations that have been created more recently, don't have as much tied funding, right? And in my 15 years of working with universities and institutions, cultural heritage institutions, there's always like an interplay and a back and forth between one type of institution and the other, right? And I don't think that is sort of anything is pitting anyone against each other. Wouldn't it be fantastic if it felt like sort of one sort of set of organizations doing and creating similar types of work and going towards similar types of goals. Yeah, I think that even just that way of thinking, right, and that the asker of the question, putting it on sort of to me as the person giving the report, why am I pitting these organizations against each other? I think that I would answer that question in saying that sort of the resource allocation, right, and all of that has already created a gap, right, between one type of institution and another, right, which is why we're talking about them as two different types of institutions instead of like one, right? And then I wonder about sort of where the responsibility lies for quote unquote help with decolonization, right? I think that there's something to be said, and then I'll wrap it up because I know we have a lot of people on the panel, but there's something to be said about these spaces, universities and museums, where they're like extremely professionalizing fields and people have PhDs in, and in order to like to specialize in certain things, right? But it's oftentimes that the work of doing inclusion or decolonization is ghettoized out into other spaces, right? So why is it not the work of the curators or of the managers and I can see, some of my fabulous colleagues here on the panel are taking up that mantle, right? They're saying that this is our work too, right? But why is it that that the institutions need help from who? From Black people, from outside? What do I know about decolonization, right? How do I how am I an expert outside of my own lived experience, right? There's an implication there that, by being people who have been subjects of colonization, that we should help, right? Even that framework, help, right? The help, assist, right? I think it's really challenging, and I'll pass it along there, but I'm really interested in hearing from others, how they took that question, whether they thought that question was in good faith, and how they would respond.
Do you feel pitted against Tom or Lisa? I mean, Lisa, you're directly museum, whereas Tom has talked about partnerships as a theatre, which obviously is a museum in the city, but you are actual city museum, Lisa. Do you feel pitted against, or how and when's partnerships worked well, or were there other aspects of Matt's research report where you thought, yeah, I can identify that as working or not working, or, and Tom, yeah, when you're ready, please.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working in museums since the late 90s, and there were moments in time when we had this called Renaissance in the regions, and we had loads of extra money, and community engagement officers became widespread, and curators had been doing some community partnership. I mean, minor, small scale, it had been going on. So I wouldn't identify with the fact that curators have never done this work. And the fact that many people believe that we've all got PhDs, I haven't got one. I wouldn't call myself a specialist in any particular one subject area. I would call myself a museum professional, definitely, and I have experience that I think is relevant. But I've always believed that my job is about access and widening that access and bringing people along together. But now we do have people embedded in the museum who are community experts. Well, I don't know how to say that, working in partnerships. So now we have people that can do that job sort of 24/7 in a way, but we have to work together with those people. So I don't feel pitted against, I welcome it, but I know our work has been slow and frustratingly slow.
Tom, you were going to say?
Well, just
Thank you,
very
Michelle.
simply, I think that anger is part of the collaboration that we need. We don't get to choose that. In this area, if we're going to tell the stories and create space to tell the stories that we want to tell and that the public needs to hear, from a starting point of such structural disadvantage, people are going to be angry. And it's up to people like me to learn how to deal with that and not make that a reason not to make progress.
Thank you, Tom. One of the, obviously, of course, you're the dramatist, so anger is a very important driver for your craft. We have a question about, on the chat saying, isn't it misguided to think there are any quick wins with decolonizing? I would have put that to Lisa and Tom, but as they've just spoken, Errol and Kelly, are there any potential quick wins with decolonizing?
If I may respond to that, I actually think that this word decolonization is less and less helpful the more that it's repeated, actually, because it means so many different things to so many different people. I do have I urge people to read Frantz Fanon, actually, for a proper definition of what decolonization means. However, I think what we need to do is to agree on an agenda and a clear agenda. And I was trying to offer that in my talk. And I think the Charter talks about that, whether you call it decolonization, inclusion and diversity, social justice. It's about 4 areas that need to be tackled: the workforce, collections, what we're doing with programs, and with the programs and collections, strategies around interpretation apply to both of those, and the restitution issue. Now, I think that is the urgent agenda that needs to be dealt with. And what I find always troubling about these conversations is the way that they become fuzzy and we start talking about all these things. We really do have to stick to, it's quite a simple set of, it's simple, but not difficult. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's simple in its clarity. Colston, let's move on from it. It's in the museum now and whatever gets done to it, it's emblematic of a deeper problem. And this deeper problem is about who works in museums, the collections, how we interpret them and classify them, where they come from, the programs that we're offering to the public and how we're engaging audiences. And there is this sticky issue about reparations and restitution. Now, I think that is the urgent agenda that we need to deal with. Whether we want to call it, inclusion and diversity, whatever, I think is irrelevant.
Thank you. Actually, sorry, Kelly, I know I asked you to respond, but I'm still going to stick with you, Kelly, if I may, but also Edson and Cleo. One of the things we're talking about here is beyond museums. And I think the fact that Tom Old Vic is here as well, which is a theatre, which the city has a museum, Colston statue, blah, blah, blah. What about this notion of beyond the walls, expanded right at the very outset? Was it Matt or Sado? It must have been Sado now, look at it. Or it could have been Errol. Expanded lens, expanded spaces, third spaces. Oh, Dr. Errol, got it down as Dr. Errol. So expanded spaces, what is there beyond the museum as we know it?
Well, I'm sorry, Kelly, you go first.
Well, no, I was only going to concur with you, Errol. So I don't think we're going to, and that is particularly about how decolonisation as a verb is used in the UK, which is, I think, in the UK, it's ultimately used as a very reformist position that doesn't bring about systemic change, and that only goes to further hoard power and resources. So, as in the UK. And there are various different approaches to decolonisation. And thank you to Errol for reminding us of the Fanon-esque focus around decolonisation, which is to think about the end of the world as we know it, I think is how Fanon says it. And so what about if we think about the end of museums as we know it? And we have this challenge that Sadi put to us at the very beginning to reimagine what a memory institution looks like. And I especially, so I want to think about two things here, and I'll try and be fairly quick. One is heritage and how the word heritage is used and its connection to inheritance. So, and its connection to meaning one who inherits something, one who has a stake in getting something from the past, and who is excluded in that, who is disinherited, who is alienated in that situation. And I think that act of alienation is very much something around around which the heritage sector in the UK is devised. And then the other thing is I want to think a little bit about, just to get us to reflect again on these systemic issues, and as Errol outlined them in a simple way, and I think it's important to be simple, thank you. But Matt also mentioned something around the resource gap. And I want to encourage you to think about not only the resource gap, but also what is the knowledge gap that has been created by these centuries worth of systemic injustice? What is and not think of it not only as a gap, but as a deficit, as something that is accumulated over time, that is being built on over time, but also as a divide, something that is systemic, and we have to put in systems in order to overcome. So resource allocation is a kind of very practical way of thinking about that, but that gap, that divide, that deficit also frames how we think of who is worthy of citizenship in this country, who is worthy of actually having a past and being recognized as human. All of these things are embedded in how we think about who inherits the past and who can be represented in our memory institutions.
Thank you. Cleo? As an artist, I'm thinking about your artist hat here really, and also relates to one of the questions we've had in the Q&A, which is what's an alternative to a database to manage a collection? So this idea of what's an alternative to how we collect our stories. Tom talked about powerful stories, etc. What alternatives are there to museums?
Well, I think a couple of things come to mind. I mean, we have to mention Cargo and Lawrence Hu and the team, who have managed to deliver a very, very high quality, amazing project, very far reaching in a very short space of time. So that is having a massive impact, and that is digital. And they've also gone on to launch the People's Platform, a kind of AR thing that you can use with your phone to see different interpretations around the plinth. So these things are possible and possibly more accessible than a physical museum, and can be experienced globally so long as you do have access to basic internet and basic technology. But to go back to kind of Tom's point really of the suppression of truth and this sense of amnesia and the outlawing of truth and the need to regain that back. And as leading reparations campaigner Esther Stanford Coze would say, public truth-telling must be undertaken before real healing can occur. And I think that's where we are now. And I think part of this as well is how we can imagine and be allowed to imagine, and how we do that. Because until we can imagine something different, we may not realize it. And do we really understand the extent of everything that needs to be changed, eradicated, and rebuilt? It can't just be about black and brown faces in white spaces and repeating what has always been done and continuing with that train of thought and train of action. And just a quote from Walter Rodney from The Groundings with My Brothers, black people are here in these institutions as part of the development of black struggle, but only as a concession designed to incorporate us within the structure. I'm thinking also of the books, the references, the theoretical assumptions, and the entire ideological underpinnings of what we have to learn in every single discipline. So that really speaks to the extent of what needs to be done. And I do think it's a two-pronged approach. I think we do need to do what we can within the mainstream, but we also need to build without the mainstream. Because as we heard earlier from Lisa, there are also political constraints within funding and within trying to do things in the mainstream that hopefully we wouldn't run into should we try and do them independently, but we also shouldn't be naive to the kind of attacks that we may experience as people of African heritage trying to do something for themselves in their own image, but hopefully with support of serious allies.
Thank you very much. Edson.
Yeah.
Yes, Errol, yeah, I'll come back if I may, Errol. Edson?
Yeah, I'm just following on what something which Tom said around normalization, suppression of truth. And I wanted to posit that actually perhaps it's the normalization of pathology that we need to think about, because that's both a contemporary problem and a historic one. And I say that because in a sense, what's been withheld is an ongoing situation of disequilibrium and disempowerment, and the celebration of that by the suppression of the stories of other people. And if we look at the nation, there's a lot that's going on in terms of suppression of class stories and gender stories, LGBT stories, Black stories. I mean, in a sense, the erection of statues to particular men of a particular class, of a particular time, of a particular color, and that not being seen as contested is as bizarre in a sense to the kind of normalization of domestic violence that suddenly we're all beginning to discuss because of the pandemic. I mean, this is an arresting point to think, what do we want to be going forward, and where do we want to take it differently? But to the point of the alternative museum, what I would suggest, or alternative spaces, I see that what's important, I think, is a strong and fluid relationship, more than an amicable relationship between different kinds of spaces, perhaps using different kinds of resources in different things. I think there's nothing wrong with community-based assets that are managed by community organizations as well, that may have particular energy around them, be able to be agile, and Seido's always talks about the agility of smaller organizations, but also that there is a decolonized, and I use that word advisedly, but decolonized museum also has a role in terms of being a repository for assets held by a community, if in the long term. And when I say in the long term, we know that community organizations can be fragile, collections can be fragile, research can be fragile. One of the problems that's happened, I think, and I just want to add that reflection on what Kelly said, I think actually our problem isn't the deficit of information, it's the lack of archiving of our stories. There is a whole wealth of African diasporic folklore and other kinds of resources that exist now. There's a whole wealth of community research, but certainly everyone around here has probably experienced research where no one knows where it's gone, interviews where no one knows where they are. So I think there's an importance to build up community-based sectors, whether they're digital and whether they're in person, but also for them to have a strong relationship with a museum sector that might be doing a different thing. But that different thing needs to understand that Black stories are stories of British stories. There is no alternative one audience for another audience. It's always here, always there, but also has methodologies and ways of looking that can reinform and change the relationship. And I think that's quite fundamental.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Errol, if you can come back with a quick point, I know you were holding, but other than that, panelist-wise, if you've got some really strong final points to make, please sort of raise your hand or whatever, let me know, because we're about to round up. So, Dr. Errol, you were going to come back to this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add and extend. Yeah, thank you, Rob. I just wanted to add, extend the points that we made about the mainstream and independent, and really support that we do have. You know, there's a change imperative in relation to what we're calling the mainstream museums, but I want to actually describe it in a slightly different way in terms of objects and experience. Now, the thing about the what I would call the colonial museum or the imperial museum is that they were built around collecting objects, and we have issues about that, which we've been talking about today, about how they're described and who they belong to, and who works in those institutions, and we have to deal with that. But what I think is exciting about the moment that we're in is the idea of a new type of museum that is not built around objects, right? And I wanted to just quote to you the Mersey delegation that came to Oxford last year to speak to the Pitt Rivers Museum. And they said that they really would like to see a museum of humanity and not of objects. That is an amazing ambition and an incredible insight into how museums could change, or the conception could change. And I think that independent museums have that possibility to do that quicker than the mainstream, because the mainstream has got all these objects that they've got to look after, right? And just give you a couple of examples. The Museum of Tomorrow in Rio de Janeiro, which is built not around objects, but around knowledge and participation and education. And the Museum of Empathy here in the UK, which is not about objects at all, it's about experience. And as I said before, objects have a limited potential to tell stories, whereas there are other ways that we can conceive of the museum. So that's really exciting. And I think that groups like BSWN can take that forward in terms of intangible heritage.
Thank you very much. Councillor Craig.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say, I think one of the things that we made quite clear, I think it's in the third action on our reparations motion, was about building in community wealth building principles in this work going forward, and I've already started to do that. And actually, what's going to be interesting, you talked about, Edson was talking about community assets, and that's something. So for me, one of our failings is that we have a number of Black-led institutions in our city that are holding on to assets, but they are nowhere near as strong as those that have been built up by many years and have been funded significantly over those years. So just as we pivoted during COVID in terms of how we worked together and responded quite quickly, we're looking at how taking those community assets, using those community wealth building principles, and actually maybe creating that third space that is not, instead of putting all of our efforts into decolonization, the point that was just made about looking at different spaces that are led by our communities and create a new approach to kind of museums and art and telling our story. So I would just say watch this space, yeah, there's a lot of good things coming in our direction, particularly through the work that Black Southwest Network has done. It has not gone unnoticed by this administration. That's all.
Thank you very much. And we've got like 3 minutes, it's going to be 2 minutes. So maybe like 1 minute, 1 minute points from Lisa, from Tom, if you'd like to say anything in response to all this, and then finally from Sade, please, to round us up.
Yeah, I would like to make the point that well, I'm going to say there was room for all ways of approaching the subject of the museum, but obviously there isn't because funding is limited. But I wouldn't say that the new reimagining of a museum has to be without objects. You might say, I would say that, wouldn't I? But I truly believe the power of objects. I mean, the Colston statue, I mean, there's so many avenues and stories and spin-offs and creativity that can come from that. So I do actually really truly believe in the power of objects to tell people stories, and we can have that both. We don't have to have one or the other. I mean, a blended approach is what we've all been talking about. So I really think, and the polarization, the rhetoric sometimes that goes on about museums, I think is sometimes harmful because it comes from a place often, and I'm not directing fingers to anybody on this panel because I know you're all experts in your field, but sometimes in the Twitter sphere, potentially there are people who would like to make this debate very polarized and not about actual reality and people on the ground doing jobs that have constraints. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much. Tom?
Yeah, just very quickly, to pick up on the point about there are no quick fixes, of course, you know, without disrespecting what Errol was saying about simple but difficult being the target, this is going to be gradual. And I think it's important to embrace that and embrace actually the excitement of the change that comes with that every step that we make is positive. And I really do believe that at this point in history, we have an unprecedented opportunity to make change real. This is a time when the train did stop, when we were able to get off and think, and we really can rebuild differently if we're brave enough to do that. And one other tiny thing, Errol, is that one kind of museum of humanity is a theatre. That is what we do. And I would love to chat further about that.
I was hoping you might say that, Tom, as a drama graduate. And finally, Sado. Sorry, everybody, we're going to go a little bit over 5 o'clock as it is now 5 o'clock. But just to round up, please, Sado.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Rob, for excellent facilitation. And really thank you to the panelists for a very, very rich discussion. I think when we started out last 10 years with funding from HLF and started on this path around heritage and culture, it was based on an idea from a racial justice organization to fill a gap that existed. And I think we've opened up a whole discussion and the city has moved forward since then. I think where we're at today around reimagining the future, I think we fundamentally believe in that, and that has really come out of this discussion. From a BSWN perspective, our role is always to facilitate, to build within the community. But I also take the note, which is obvious when you do a piece of research and produce the data and bring out voices of communities. This notion about cultural and mainstream organization, it's not one or the other, but I think we've been too much around the conversation about institutions. And I think we're in a place where we have to begin to center that power within communities and build those institutions that reflect our everyday experience. So I feel super excited about the next steps. And as an organization, we're looking forward to taking some of the key points that emerge from this discussion today. But again, to just say thank you to everyone that contributed to the 150 people that attended. And yes, super excited. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, superb, brilliant. Thanks, everybody. Very rich. I look forward to the recording myself because I think I missed most of it. It's so rich. So it's going to be a great resource. I look forward to sharing it all with you. Thank you very much for attending, for asking questions. Thank you very much for a wonderful list of panelists. And I hope you got a lot of it. It's definitely a long walk ahead, but Bristol is at the front of that journey, I can proudly say. So thanks everybody again for attending, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.